100 years ago, a film premiered in Germany that was different from the others. And that's incidentally what the title of the film, Anders als die anderen, actually translates to. This film was one of the first, if not the first in history, to openly address the matter of same-sex love. That in itself would have already been remarkable, given that publicly lived and acknowledged homosexuality was, at the time and for many more decades to come, considered to be illegal and immoral. What made the film even more remarkable then was the fact that it was a compassionate look at the plight of gay men and, in fact, part of an early effort to decriminalize homosexuality. This was something that Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a consultant on the film and a pioneer in LGBT studies, championed for as long as he lived. And I'll talk about this a bit more later on, not least of all because he even appeared in the film himself to advocate for this. We see the major plot elements of the film mirrored in many of the other noteworthy LGBT-related motion pictures throughout the century that followed. I'm not going to mince words here. We're talking about blackmail and suicide. These were grim recurring themes because they reflected something that was a grim reality for many people. In a way, it's as simple and devastating as that.
Somebody once called this law against homosexuals the Blackmailers' Charter.
I can draw attention to the fault in the existing law.
Knowing it will destroy you utterly.
Yes.
For a long time now, however, there has been this notion that this death and destruction is all there is to the history of homosexuality on film. But if Anders als die anderen tells us anything, it's that there's sympathy to be found in unexpected places and at unexpected times. It's easy to make broad assumptions, and I'm not saying that they are wrong. The history of homosexuality on film is a history of blackmail and suicide. It's a history of prison settings and all-girls schools. It's a history of homosexuality being used as a source of humor, either by caricature or something like the mistaken for queer trope. It's a history of subtext, of subliminal messaging about villainy and perversion. And above all, it's a history of censorship. But beneath all of that, there is something more, isn't there? Something deeper, something that teaches us about the way in which society has negotiated social progress and backlash in times of turmoil. What's more, quite a few people in the film industry were gay, lesbian, or bisexual themselves. How did they navigate all of this? Were they able to have a positive, visible impact on LGBT representation? Things have gotten a lot better in recent years, there's no denying that. But history is not a straight line that moves only in one direction. We need to take stock to understand where we are in this process and whether we've come as far as we'd like to think. Honestly, there's no better occasion for this than the centennial anniversary of Anders als die anderen, so let's rewind and start again at the beginning.
Why are you wearing these clothes?
Because I just went gay all of a sudden.
"100 years ago, the First World War ended, and with it the old order of the world. Revolutions swept across the European continent, inspired by the uprising in Russia, and some monarchies fell to the anger of the masses. In Germany, a republic was born, the first in the country's history. this republic, the so-called Weimarer Republik, had one of the most progressive constitutions of the time, but is now mostly remembered as a flawed and ultimately failed attempt at democracy. It began under the shadow of the Peace Treaty of Versailles and ended when Adolf Hitler came into power. You might be wondering why I'm telling you all of this, but it's important to know when you want to study the history of homosexuality on film, because that's where it all really started in 1919, just after the revolution, when there was a short period where there was no censorship. That's when Anders als die Andern got made. Richard Oswald, the director, was seizing the opportunity during and after the World War to make a series of educational films about topics that had hitherto been considered off-limits, such as sexually transmitted diseases, abortion, prostitution, and, well, homosexuality. His advisor on these films was the sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who was such an important figure in LGBT history that you should absolutely look him up if you've never heard of him before. He was, among other things, a gay rights activist and the head of the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft in Berlin, a serious scientific research institute for all matters to do with sex and sexuality. People could even go there to receive counseling. Hirschfeld himself was gay and, same as Richard Oswald, Jewish, which might already give you an idea of the kind of opposition they faced, despite some parts of the country, especially Berlin, embracing the film and its message. Now, in order to understand just how groundbreaking Anders als die Andern was, we need to take a look at the way in which homosexuality had been depicted on screen up to that point, or let's say how it had been alluded to. When you dive into the early years of cinema, you're likely to find yourself submerged in some obscure material. One claim that I've read, which baffles me to be honest, is that this French short film by Georges Méliès supposedly shows a homosexual act between the sun and the moon. Never mind that these are celestial entities, Méliès' own film catalogue clearly refers to the sun as male and the moon as female, so I don't think that their metaphorical, romantic encounter, such as it is, can be described as a meaningful part of LGBT film history, even if you think that there's some kind of ambiguity involved here. But hey, maybe that's just me. Then there are Algy the Miner, in which an effeminate man is sent west to toughen up, and A Florida Enchantment, in which a woman eats a magical seed that transforms her into a man. These American films were rooted in tropes and traditions from the stage and the vaudeville circuit, but on film they were considered to be slightly provocative, especially A Florida Enchantment, which has the optics of sexual diversity, even if it doesn't have any actual message of the sort, and is more of a marital comedy of errors that hasn't aged particularly well. Of more interest to me anyway is another film that involves cross-dressing, and it brings us back to Germany. I'm talking about Ich möchte kein Mann sein from Ernst Lubitsch. Lubitsch, of course, came to his greatest fame later in Hollywood, with Billy Wilder being his most ardent admirer. Allegedly, Billy Wilder had a poster in his office saying, "How would Lubitsch do it?"
Lubitsch does, yes. Well, that's. If I could explain it, this is like if I knew the formula, I would patent it. But nobody quite knows how to arrive.
Well, as Billy Wilder said, it's not easy to explain how Lubitsch did what he did, or why only he was able to do it so well. Let's just say that his so-called Lubitsch touch was very light, very sophisticated, very playful, naughty, and full of more or less innocent innuendo. Even in his early work we see elements of that. Ich möchte kein Mann sein, which means I don't want to be a man, is a comedic silent film. And I probably should have mentioned that all the films that I'm talking about here were silent films. sound film only became a thing in the late 1920s and early 1930s, just by way of explanation. The plot in this case is that a girl wants to escape from her strict home life, so she walks around the city pretending to be a man, and shenanigans ensue. Of course, she ends up meeting her guardian while she's out and about in this get-up, and they get drunk together, and she realizes that he's not so bad after all. Now the weird thing happens. In other cross-dressing films, the love interest usually becomes aware of the deception at some point and plays along to fool the imposter themselves, and that's where the romantic confusion lies. Everyone is ultimately reliably straight from their own perspective. Here, however, there is no suggestion that the guardian knows it's her. They start making out while he's still under the impression that she's a young man. And in the next morning, he's not even bothered by the memory and just tells her to keep their little adventure a secret. Of course, he's happy once it's revealed that it's her, but what the film basically tells us is that he's either bisexual or that it's not a big deal if people of the same sex make out when they're drunk. It seems like this is a type of LGBT-related content that tended to fly under the radar. Even if contemporary viewers were aware of the implications, they didn't necessarily remark upon them, and they certainly didn't in this case as far as I know. Who's to say how many films were out there with similar scenes or even more subtle suggestions? The main reason that we're still talking about this film is the fact that Lubitsch became a widely acclaimed director later in life. Not everyone was that skilled or that lucky. It's estimated that up to 90% of the films that were made before 1929 are lost. Anders als die anderen was thought to have been lost for the longest time as well, and what we can watch today is only a fragmentary reconstruction. Of course, Anders als die anderen wanted to provoke a reaction, namely the repeal of paragraph 175, in which the illegality of homosexual acts between men was enshrined in the German law. Even the reviewers in 1919 couldn't find a way to talk around the issue at the heart of it. This led to much controversy, and in 1920, censorship was reinstated and the film was banned for public display. Hirschfeld retained a copy at his institute where he could still organize screenings for educational purposes, but that was it. In 1927, he made a documentary about the laws of love and reused some footage from the film to illustrate a presentation on the topic of homosexuality. It's this reused footage that was found in the Ukraine in the 1970s. The Nazis had destroyed all other copies several decades earlier. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's imagine instead that we're in the 1920s now. Anders als die anderen has been banned, but it's made an impression. In Berlin, a gay subculture is thriving. The same is true for Paris and other European cities, although perhaps to a slightly lesser degree. In the US, Hollywood is gaining the reputation of being a hotbed of sin, despite its relatively tame output. There have been same-sex kisses on screen, but only in a strictly platonic sense. Now, who's going to be the first one to show a non-platonic same-sex kiss? Enter Cecil B. DeMille.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
You may know him from his appearance in Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard. He was a director who was famous for his epic films with Christian themes, such as The Ten Commandments. Admittedly, he may seem like an odd candidate for this, but he really wasn't. The kiss occurs in the film Manslaughter in 1922 during an elaborate fantasy flashback to an orgy among ancient Romans. Despite being fairly religious, DeMille was also a bit of a hypocrite, and he loved this kind of debauchery, both in his private life, where he had several mistresses at the same time in a sort of harem, and in his films. At least for as long as he was able to sneak it in before moral censorship took hold of Hollywood in the mid-1930s, when the so-called production code became enforced. DeMille was actually inadvertently responsible for that in no small part, because he expanded on what he had started in Manslaughter with the film The Sign of the Cross that featured a seductive lesbian dance, his logic being that you had to show the wickedness of the Roman way of life in order to contrast it with the wholesomeness of Christianity. Frankly, he just knew that sex sold, and this was important in the Depression era to lure people into the cinema. It didn't just do that, it also provoked great outrage and led to the stricter application of the production code. But that was in the 1930s.
I'm very thirsty.
In the Hollywood of the 1920s, there's nothing like what we see in The Sign of the Cross later on. The kiss in Manslaughter isn't even in the center of the shot. There's a kiss in the first Oscar-winning picture, Wings, between two soldiers who have a very close friendship, and modern audiences will probably view it as homoerotic, but that's debatable in my opinion, and we find a lot of these homosocial elements in older films, especially when they have a military or male bonding component. Then there's the Oscar Wilde adaptation, Salome. It's often cited in LGBT film history because it was allegedly filmed with an all-gay cast and displays sensibilities that are supposedly not straight, whatever that means, but it does not explicitly feature any piece of dialogue or scene that could be construed as visible homosexuality. There has been thorough analysis of how the film is implicitly suffused with queerness, but this raises the question: what makes a film LGBT-related at all? Does it count if someone watching it today without all that background knowledge won't pick up on any of it? I'm honestly personally not sure on which side of the argument I fall. Certainly, it should be noted that Alla Nazimova, who was the star and producer of the film, was openly lesbian, or at the very least bisexual, and hosted parties at her mansion in Hollywood that were popular with an underground lesbian scene, which she referred to as the sewing circle. In Germany, meanwhile, films were being made despite the ban of Anders als die Andern and the mounting turbulence of political and social unrest that featured homosexual themes or characters in a pretty straightforward way. In 1924, a film adaptation of the novel Michael from the Danish gay author Herman Bang retained the homosexual subtext of the book. The story is about an aging painter who takes a particular interest in one of his models, and the intensity of his emotions only makes sense to me anyway when you interpret it as him being in love with him. An earlier adaptation had been directed by Maurits Stiller in 1916. Stiller was gay, but in his film version, the homosexual connotations of the source material are very subdued, if not erased, as far as we can tell, since a good portion of the film is lost. By comparing these two versions, the earlier of which was made in Sweden and the later in Germany, albeit by Danish director Carl Theodor Dreyer, we can trace the liberalization that characterized parts of the German society in the 1920s and allowed the cinema in the Weimar era to get away with pretty risky topics and taboos. However, please keep in mind that these films were not necessarily progressive just because they were bold. In 1928, Geschlecht in Fesseln depicted a man in prison who's seduced by a fellow inmate, threatened with blackmail after being released, and ultimately driven to suicide, which he commits together with his wife. That's a trope bingo right there. Ultimately, the story is more about the married couple and the strain that the man's prison stint puts on their relationship than anything else. So let's skip right ahead to a much more fascinating film. Behold, Die Büchse der Pandora, or Pandora's Box. Now this film is just wild. It's remarkable because it features the first clearly lesbian character in a film ever, and it got away with that because everything else is just that much more outrageous given the morals of the time. The film centers on Lulu, played by Louise Brooks, who drives everyone in her vicinity mad with desire for her. And when I say everyone, I mean plenty of men and one woman. Certainly, this emphasizes just how attractive she's supposed to be if even a woman falls in love with her. During the course of the story, which takes many tragic turns and even sees Lulu become a prostitute, she's not portrayed as a classic femme fatale, however. There's something innocent to her compared to the violence of the man in her life. She's as much a victim of the lust that she inspires as she is someone who feels liberated by the power that she thinks it gives her. While she does not return the feelings of the lesbian character, a countess, she does prize her friendship, and the countess does everything to help her get out of the unfortunate situations that she finds herself in. In that and in every other regard, the countess is just like all the other suitors. She wears male clothing, which was a strong visual indicator for lesbianism, but she's not ridiculed or caricatured. Her ending is not a happy one. Then again, all the characters are doomed by their association with Lulu, most of all, Lulu herself. As we move into the 1930s, the trend towards liberalization continues and it sweeps through Germany and Hollywood alike. I plan on covering the 1930s and 40s in another video, but I can't end this one without some perspective on what was to come. Sound film had its breakthrough, and in Hollywood a time began that we now call the pre-code era, which is not entirely accurate because the production code already existed since 1930. It's just that the production studios didn't much care about adhering to it, so we get cinematic depictions of gangsters, promiscuity, alcoholism, and so on, up to 1934, when a certificate by the Production Code Office became a prerequisite for any film that wanted to get a wide commercial release. That's when the tentatively emerging LGBT characters are shoved back into the closet for decades to come. Similarly, in Germany, the break comes around the same time, in 1933. Just 2 years earlier, the film Mädchen in Uniform had been the first to focus on a lesbian love story, specifically a girl falling in love with one of her teachers. The film was highly successful internationally, and Irving Thalberg, a producer at MGM, was so taken by the sensitive treatment of the topic that he tried to add lesbian scenes and undertones to his biopic of Queen Christina of Sweden, a real-life lesbian, played by Greta Garbo, a real-life bisexual. It didn't really work out because the censors couldn't be fully ignored even in the pre-code era, but the impact that Mädchen in Uniform had can hardly be overstated. Eleanor Roosevelt was a fan, which is the reason that it was even shown in the US to begin with. So that's where we are at the start of the 1930s. And then the Nazis come into power. This was devastating for the German film industry on many levels, as one might imagine, although some of the effects took a few years to unfold. Many members of the cast and crew of Mädchen in Uniform, for example, were Jewish and forced into exile. Those who did not leave were murdered in the concentration camps or put through other ordeals that cost them their lives. Behind all of the films that I've mentioned, you can find biographies like this, and they are worth looking up, not least of all to honor those who are nowadays largely forgotten. Many members of the film industry who were Jewish or otherwise opposed to the regime left before long and emigrated to other countries where few of them were able to continue their careers. Konrad Veidt, who had played the protagonist in Anders als die Andern and still gone on to become the major star of German expressionist cinema, emigrated in 1933 because his wife was Jewish. It's a bit ironic that most people only know him as the Nazi villain in Casablanca. Reinhold Schünzel, who had played the blackmailer in Anders als die Andern, was Jewish and also a director. He was made an honorary Aryan by the regime because he was so popular, and directed under the Nazi rule, for example, Victor and Victoria, that was later remade with Julie Andrews. Still, he didn't feel safe and emigrated in 1937, appearing in Hollywood films as an actor again, such as in Hitchcock's Notorious. And what about Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld? He had left Germany in 1931 to travel around the world and give lectures. Even in the 1920s, he had been harassed by the Nazi Party through smear campaigns and physical threats. That's why he knew that he'd be in danger if he returned from that lecture tour, and in fact he never did return to Germany. In 1933, one of the first things that the Nazis did after they had come into power was to order the closure of his institute in Berlin. He was sitting in a cinema in Paris when news footage came on that showed how they had stormed the institute, destroyed the place, and ransacked the library, which had carried a unique collection of literature and other writings of the time about homosexuality and related topics. Just a few days later, on May the 9th, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, was at the premiere of the new film by Richard Oswald, who had directed Anders als die Andern and would emigrate later that year. This film featured Josef Schmidt, who was one of the most famous singers in Germany. He was also Jewish. Goebbels applauded the film and praised its quality. The next day, he went to the Opernplatz, where thousands of books had been gathered to be burned, among them the books from the Institute, and he gave a speech to incite hatred in everyone listening. That was the perversity of the situation. Hirschfeld died in his French exile in 1935, believing his life's work to be lost. It was not until 1994 that homosexuality was fully legalized in Germany.